guess I'll leave this here until February 10th, so I know we'll have one game. How many people play Scrabble? How about Words with Friends? For those of you who are not familiar with Words with Friends, it's a game that you download onto your smartphone and you essentially play Scrabble with friends through your phone. So every time people are doing this, it's not necessarily texting. They could be wasting time playing a game. When I talked to the children, I talked about how Jesus, God, had made the rules. And the gospel lesson that I just read talks about how Jesus, right at the beginning of his ministry in Capernaum, in his home area, he goes into the synagogue and he begins to teach. Now, the way it would work in a synagogue is someone would come up to teach, they would read from the scrolls, the Torah scrolls, and then they would sit down to teach. You've heard the expression, the seat of power? That's where that comes from. Back in that day, you wouldn't stand up to teach like a teacher does in school or like I do up here, but you would have a seat and you would sit down, and when you sat down, a hush would fall over the crowd because people understood that teaching was going to begin, so they would pay attention and listen to that. And so Jesus gets up and he talks about the scriptures, and people are just kind of blown away by the way he's talking. In Jewish society, the understanding was, Jewish religion I should say, the understanding was that you obtain righteousness, that is right relationship with God, by following the rules, the law. The law is laid out in the Torah, also the Talmud, which was explained to me by a rabbi one time. If you think of the Torah as the Constitution, the Talmud is a series of laws that have been worked out in the courts that kind of spell out exactly what this stuff means and how it plays out day to day. So Jesus is up there teaching, and people are just blown away because his understanding of these laws and the reasoning behind them and how they fit was just beyond anything they had ever heard. And when you're looking at obtaining righteousness by following a set of laws, you tend to get very rigid in how you follow them. And that's what was a little different here. Because Jesus is talking about the laws, but then he's saying, but this is the way it was intended. And this is the way it's supposed to be lived out. And we see several examples of that in various teachings throughout the Gospels. Now, Paul is dealing with that same kind of situation in the city of Corinth. Now, Corinth was a very, very busy metropolitan type of city. It was large. It had a lot of travelers coming through it. It was affected by all the different cultures. Now, today, our culture is spread every place. Internet, TV, radio, whatever. Things go throughout the entire world. But back in New Testament times, that wasn't the case. Things were kind of isolated. But you see, Corinth was strategically placed in an area where it encouraged ships to come in. You see, there was a narrow isthmus there. Remember the building of the Panama Canal, or remember reading about it, depending on your age? Probably most of us reading about it. The reason they cut that slice across there was because for a ship to go from, let's say, New York to San Francisco, it would have to go all the way around the tip of South America and back up again. Needless to say, that's a long trip. So if you cut a hole through the Isthmus of Panama, the narrow thing there's some lakes and stuff, made it a good location to do this, you could cut the trip time in half. Well, Corinth had something similar. They had a very narrow portion where their city was located. And what they did, they didn't dig a trench, but what they did is they took stones and they implanted them in the ground, put them in there really, really hard, and made a roadway, essentially. And then they got a bunch of trees and they cut them down and stripped the branches off, so they were essentially road. That's because they had these things in the city. The interesting thing to me when I read those is an awful lot of the stuff that's mentioned there we have as problems today. Because again, our culture, like we kind of adopt everything from all over the world and just kind of put it together. So one of the things that was happening, there was a Christian church in the city of Corinth. And they wrote letters to Paul and said, listen, we got this problem. What do we do about this? And we don't have those letters. But we do have Paul's answers. And that's 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He writes back to the people and he says in this particular, now as to the matter of meat sacrificed to idols. So he's answering this question that they asked him. The practice was there were a lot of pagan religions in Corinth, as was common at the time. So you would have temples to Diana or one of these pagan gods where people would bring sacrifices. A lot of times they would bring meat because it was something significant. They would bring the meat and they would sacrifice it to an idol. Now, once the meat had been sacrificed to an idol to an awful lot of people, this was no good any longer because it had been sacrificed to that idol. I can't eat it. I'm taken away from this god. And so, therefore, I can't eat this. Well, people would take it and they would put it in the market. And so what happened if a regular steak is $10 and there's this steak that was sacrificed to an idol, and they sell it for $1, $2, because people aren't going to pay the same as a good piece of meat for this idol piece of meat. And there were people in the church, go figure this, that were poor, that had money trouble. We don't have anybody in this church that has any money troubles, right? And so when they went to the market, they'd see $10 for the steak, $2. I'm buying this one. And then what happened in the church, believe it or not, people started to gossip about this. That doesn't happen in churches, right? Oh, never happens in churches. And they said, look at these people eating that meat. It's bad because it was sacrificed to an idol. They can't do that, but the other guy said, well, idol is nothing. The meat's cheap. I'll eat that. Helps out with the family. I can pay the rent. I can get something for my kids, whatever it is. And it became a big problem in the church, and that's why they wrote to Paul. And I love what Paul says. And this is one of those passages that I kind of use as a guideline for my life and what I do and how I go about it. He says, well, an idol is nothing. It's a little statue of wood or some metal or something that some person took and fashioned it with his hands and made it into this little statue. Somebody takes it home and puts it up on the counter and gives sacrifice to it. But since it's only a piece of wood or stone or metal, that's nothing. It's like a cup or something. It has no power. There's nothing about it. So if I put meat in front of it and sacrifice it to it, what does it do to the meat? Nothing. It's nothing. It can't do anything to the meat. So if you eat the meat or you don't eat the meat, it doesn't really matter because the idol didn't do it, and that's your choice. But, and this is the part that I like, there are those among you, he says, that sometimes their faith is a little fragile. And their faith hangs on something. Like there's a lot of people, I'm sure you've heard them on TV or maybe you've met some, who feel that the earth was created in 7 24-hour days, and that what the account in Genesis is a literal, essentially historically accurate account. My personal belief on that is that, yeah, that's the way things were created. If you look at the fossil record, the order is actually the same, just the time frame is off. So God was talking to Moses, who was really educated, but Moses was going to go down the mountain and talk to a bunch of slaves, ex-slaves. Do you teach slaves to read and write? No, because they get ideas that could be dangerous. So you don't teach them to read and write. They're illiterate. Now, how is an illiterate person going to understand the concept of ability? I can see it on paper, but I still can't get the concept, and I'm an educated person. So I think God said, all right, fine. We got these things that happen. Let's break it up into periods so people get the general idea God created. And then we'll call the period days to make it easier to comprehend. Makes perfect sense to me. But for some people, if you reject the 7 24-hour day literalism, then your faith is worthless, and that you are not following God, and their faith is so fragile that if that one little piece comes undone, it can kind of undo the whole thing. And so what Paul was saying was, listen, there are some among you who have this kind of fragile faith. That they believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and that's great, but they kind of hang that hat on all these other things. And one of those is, gee, if you go near an idol or something like this, that might be considered idolatry. Big sin there. Probably one of the biggest. And if this meat was sacrificed to an idol, eating that meat would be bad. And so for some people, if they saw you eating the meat, it will create a problem for their faith. And so Paul says, if it's the meat, the idol's nothing, it doesn't matter whether you eat or don't eat, but pay attention to the faith of your brother and sister, and don't do something that's going to undermine their faith. If you eating meat is going to cause a problem for somebody, well then don't do it. Yes, you have the right to eat the meat if you want, but you also have a responsibility. to make sure that you are encouraging each other in your faith and building each other up in your faith and not breaking each other down. I love that. You know, do I go to this place? Do I eat this or drink this or engage in this? You know, if somebody sees me who might not be in the same place spiritually that I am, could that cause a problem for them? It might. So you know what? I won't do it. You see, this points out a responsibility that we have, a very, very big responsibility. You know what the Great Commission was, right? Who knows the Great Commission? What was the Great Commission?
Go and make disciples.
Right. Of all people, teaching them the things that I have commanded. Right? Jesus said that we're supposed to go out and make disciples. We take that as the mission of the church. Our book, the United Methodist Book of Discipline, says the purpose of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. The local church, most significant arena where that happens. So our charge, that's why the kids are downstairs. Because we're seeking to make disciples of Jesus Christ for those kids. But we also are called to help make disciples among others. And that means that not only do we say, well, come to church. We're having a game night and a potluck dinner. It should be an awful lot of fun. Why don't you come and eat something? Doesn't mean you have to go to church. But, you know, come on and join us for this. It'll be fun. We're supposed to do those kind of things. But if what we do kind of undermines what we say, we've got to really question whether we should be doing it. And people know, for the most part, people know that you guys attend church. You have mentioned to them at some point, or you said something about being involved in something at church. Remember that study we did last year, When Christians Get It Wrong by Adam Howell? We talked about it a lot. That study said Hamilton had done interviews with a bunch of young people, between 18 and 35, I think, was the group he did. And what had happened is these young people had rejected Christianity. Now, when I was a kid, we belonged to the Demorest Baptist Church. Yes, I was a dunker, now I'm a sprinkler. And I was made to go to church every Sunday. And when I went to college, when I was home on weekends, I was made to go to church. Gotta say that when I didn't come home, I didn't go to church. My son Jim did, put me to shame. And then when Tori and I got married, we went to church on Christmas and Easter. No people like that. And then Jim was born. And Jim was close to 2 years old, and Tori was pregnant at the time, and we said to each other, we need to go back to church to get the kids a Christian education. If I had any idea where that led, See, that's the pattern that most of us are used to. You know, you grow up and take some time off, and then you go back. That's kind of what most of us did. You know, you teenager, rebellious, college-type years, you kind of wander away, and then you come back. But what Hamilton found in talking to these young people is they had made a decision to reject Christianity. It wasn't because they didn't like Jesus, and they didn't like what was taught. They liked it a lot. They thought it was wonderful. But the reason they rejected Christianity was because what they saw in Christians. And all of them knew one or two or three that actually did what they talked about. But all these young people said, they're judgmental. They're hypocritical. They're anti-science. The evolution thing. They're anti-homosexual. They're closed-minded. If what you do is going to cause somebody else to fall, don't do it. As a community, us, the church, haven't done real well. People don't see Christ reflected in us. Now, one of the interesting statements I found out in listening to that study is one young guy was talking about Christians as being hypocritical. And he says, you know what, I don't necessarily have a problem with Christians being hypocritical. Because you know what, I'm hypocritical too. I say I'm going to do something and I don't do it. So if you're hypocritical, it's not so bad. But the problem is, if you're hypocritical and you say, I'm not a hypocrite, and you deny it. Saying people are not consistent. Now, that being said, a lot of this perception comes from the people in the Christian community who have the loudest voices in the public square. How many mainline, middle-of-the-road preachers do you hear on TV? You don't. You hear the very, very, very conservatives. You hear people that preach a prosperity gospel. You hear people who preach a hellfire and brimstone type of thing. People who preach a very, very rigid understanding of what it means to follow God. And they're the loudest ones. So you've got your Pat Robinsons and all these people who are very, very verbal. And a lot of people's perceptions is formed by this. Because we kind of like people who like us, so we don't like talk about our faith because we're afraid that might put people off. And so the result of that is that the only vision they have of what it means to be Christians from these folks, who most of us don't agree with. We think that they interpret things a little bit out of whack. You see, that's why it's really important for us regular people to actually do this stuff that we talk about. To love people, even if we don't like them. You know? To help people in need, even maybe if it impinges on us a little bit. To let people know that there's a God that loves them. I told you a couple of weeks ago I was on the search tree. I had the opportunity to be there with 21 candidates who had not been on this before, as well as a number of team members. So we had a reunion of that here at this church yesterday. There were about 30 some odd people here. These kids who, before that weekend, had never seen each other, came in and were embracing and hugging and just shared this connection because of this experience of God that they had. They were even talking about the possibility of doing a search mission trip. Because they began to understand on this weekend what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ and to live this stuff out in real ways. To not get so caught up in a set of rules that you forget about the reason the rules were made in the first place. That was one of the problems Jesus had with the scribes and Pharisees. There was so much about the law, they forgot that the law was made for man, not man for the law, as Jesus put it. Whether you know it or not, people watch you, and they watch what you're doing and how you react to things, and they judge Jesus based on you. Kind of a sobering thought, isn't it? People's opinion of Jesus is based on what you do and how you live. Be a good ambassador for Christ. Let's pray. Lord God, we give you thanks that you do indeed call us to be your ambassadors, that you have given us opportunities to be in service and to be a witness for you. We also know, God, that sometimes we get caught up in rules. Sometimes things get in the way. But help us to be mindful of the fact that we do have responsibilities, and people will judge you based on what we do, and that our opportunities that lead people to you are truly opportunities and can be a tremendous blessing to each and every one of us. So God, as we go from this place this morning, go with us and keep us mindful of these opportunities. Help us to remember that, yeah, if I'm doing this thing, it might hurt somebody else. Maybe I shouldn't do it. So that we can build people up rather than break them down. And God, for those people and for all who are suffering throughout our world, we bring their names in praise to you, knowing that for many there are difficult times. There They have concerns and worries. Sometimes they have hurts. And so we come lifting their names before you because you have told us to do so, and that you alone have the power to give people a sense of comfort and a sense of it'll be okay, even in the midst of the worst things. So for Jonathan and Ariana,